The border between England and Wales has been a hotly contested area for many hundreds of years. Offa's Dyke, which closely follows the modern border, is named after Offa, the Anglo-Saxon king of Mercia between the years 757 and 796. It is believed to be an attempt to define a border. Relationships between the English and the Welsh were not always strained. In the early days of King Edward I's reign over England, this is apparent by the fact that David, brother of the Welsh Prince Rhuddlan, defected to the English side. This meant that David was actually fighting against his own brother, only for David to later defect back to the Welsh side. This probably served as a tipping point for Edward, who became obsessed with conquering and subduing the Welsh once and for all time. In the year 1277, Edward and his army left Chester in England and marched into Wales. Their route took them along the coast, first through Flint, then Rhuddlan, and on to Conwy, which is of course close to Conwy. To reinforce his status, Edward began construction of what we call his Ring of Iron, a chain of imposing castles from which he could exert his dominance over the Welsh. The first castle which Edward built was at Flint. Located on the River Dee estuary, the castle was 1 day's march from Chester. Crucially though, if the route across land was cut off by a Welsh uprising, Flint Castle could still be reached and replenished by sailing ships thanks to its being right beside the river bank. In Edward's eyes, this was important, as evidenced in his similar coastal castles at Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech and Beaumaris. Just as Flint was a 1-day march from Chester, Rhuddlan was a 1-day march from Flint. This made the area around Rhuddlan an obvious place to build a fortification. But why Rhuddlan? Wouldn't Rhyl have made more sense? After all, Rhyl is coastal, but Rhuddlan is some 5 kilometres, or about 3 miles, inland. The River Clwyd flows from the mountainous inland areas of North Wales, passes Rhuddlan and meets the sea at sunny Rhyl. The landscape between Rhuddlan and Rhyl is almost completely flat. The depth of the River Clwyd varies dramatically twice every day as the tides of the sea ebb and flow. Rhuddlan is about at the limit of the tidal reach along the river, making Rhuddlan the first point from the sea where crossing on the river on foot was relatively easy. Going further inland, the terrain quickly becomes hilly and difficult to traverse. For thousands of years, Rhuddlan has been used as a safe, suitable crossing point of the river for travellers and traders, whether local or from distant lands. Edward realised that if he built a castle at Rhyl, it could become liable to flooding. The surrounding land could be marshland, and importantly, his army would be unable to cross the river due to the rising tides. The site of modern-day Rhuddlan is slightly raised above much of the surrounding area, so Edward realised that a castle built here would be in a commanding position over the local area. Rhuddlan presented just one problem for Edward as a site for a castle. It would be difficult to supply the castle by sailing ships. The sea was 3 miles distant, and the River Clwyd meandered its way some distance from the rocky higher ground on which he wanted to build his new castle. In a moment of perhaps mad ingenuity, Edward thought to himself, the river is too far from the castle, so what I'll have to do is simple. I'll move the river. And that is just what Edward did. He moved the river. More precisely, he brought a workforce of labourers from the Lincolnshire fens to Rhuddlan. He then tasked them with digging and dredging along a 2-mile stretch to straighten, reroute and deepen the River Clwyd. When completed, after 3 years of hard work, the river would have flown alongside the very outer walls of the castle grounds, right beside this tower, the Gillet Tower, where this lower section of moat would have formed a small dock. Leading up from this dock is a huge dry moat, which surrounded the other 3 sides of the castle grounds. The first castle to be started being built by Edward was at Flint, but such was Edward's desire to build hastily that construction of Rhuddlan Castle commenced a few months later, still in the year 1277. Initially, construction works at Rhuddlan were overseen by the French Master Bertram of Gascony, France. However, the master mason of Flint Castle, James of St. George, soon took over. Another French engineer, this time from the Savoy region, James, remained in charge until work was completed. The castle design is often described as concentric. The inner ward is surrounded by the walls of the castle itself. The castle and immediately grounds around it, called the outer ward, are in turn surrounded by defensive walls, which are in turn surrounded by the dry moat on 3 sides and the River Clwyd on the 4th side. The dry moat might not at first sound impressive. However, standing here in the bottom of the moat, I am soon given a feeling of just how steep and tall the sides would have provided an effective defensive barrier. Not least, the sheer amount of these arrow slits allowing Edward's supporters to effectively defend themselves from anyone brave or even daft enough to make it into the moat. The castle has 2 entrances to the inner ward. The entrances are both protected by a tower or gatehouse on each side of the entrance. Unusually though, the entrances are placed at the corners of the castle. This gives the castle a unique diamond-shaped profile from above. When built, Rhuddlan Castle was much more than the empty stone shell we see today. Within the walls of the inner ward or area, there would have been a great hall where meals would have been eaten, entertainments would have been enjoyed, and much more. There would also have been kitchens with ovens, where bread would be baked and meals would be prepared. There would also have been a chapel or prayer room, as well as private dwellings and living quarters. The outer ward would also have had buildings. There would have been stores in which to keep the ingredients which the kitchens would need, stables for the various animals, and even a smithy where metals could be worked to create all manner of metal items. Edward also built a town here at Rhuddlan, a place where his hundreds of workers could live safely. The town was built in an area north of Rhuddlan Castle, a safe haven which, just like the castle, was surrounded by a defensive structure. Part of that still remains today. Here, just off the junction of Gwyndy Street and Caernarfon Avenue, we can find the remains of some of these ditches. The ditch would have completely surrounded the town. The town side of the ditch would have featured a timber palisade fence which afforded protection from invaders to the townspeople. So, that was that. In 1277, King Edward I of England built some castles and conquered Wales. Then everyone went home and lived happily ever after. Nah, it's not quite so simple. Although Edward set out in 1277 to conquer Wales and the Welsh, it wasn't until 1284 that the Statute of Rhuddlan was drawn up. It established an agreement that the Welsh would accept that the English were now in charge and that the Welsh Princes would lose their powers. The statute was signed here at Rhuddlan Castle. This is when the lands of former Welsh Princes were officially ceded to the English crown and English common law was introduced. Footnote: I do know that some historians believe the statute was actually signed here at Parliament House in Rhuddlan, and to be honest, nobody quite knows for sure. However, it's most likely that such an important document would be signed at the castle. King Edward I of England was now King of England and Wales. He made a promise to the Welsh that he would appoint a person to take the title of Prince of Wales. It is rumoured that he promised the person chosen would be born in Wales and would not speak a word of English. Edward kept his word. Edward had a son who was born in 1284 at Caernarfon. Edward's son was perhaps confusingly also named Edward. The newborn son, who was born in Wales and clearly could speak no words of English, or any other language for that matter, would go on to hold the title of Prince of Wales. Although King Edward had other sons also, they died at early ages. This left the young Edward in the position of the king's eldest son and therefore heir to the throne. When King Edward I died in 1307, his eldest living son, Edward, Prince of Wales, became the new King Edward II of England and Wales. This started the tradition whereby the title Prince of Wales is always held by the heir to the throne. We've seen this in recent times when Prince Charles was heir to the throne and Prince of Wales. Now that Charles is king, of course his son William is now the current Prince of Wales. Of course, the Welsh weren't going to take this authoritarianism laying down. There were what are politely called uprisings. For instance, when Rhuddlan Castle was about 100 years old, Owain Glyndŵr rebelled against the English king, King Henry IV. Further actions were seen during the English Civil War. After this war ended, the castle was slighted or partially demolished, such that it could never be used again in any acts of war or aggression. Today, Rhuddlan Castle is laid to ruin. Much of the main castle building remains, but all the other buildings which had once have been inside the inner and outer wards have long gone. I personally remember visiting Rhuddlan Castle many years ago, perhaps in the 1980s or the 90s. My lasting memory of that visit is just how little there was to explore. Just this empty shell of the main castle walls. Over time, Cadw have put quite some effort into making several of the towers accessible. Freestanding spiral staircases have been installed in some of the towers, which now allow us to explore. One of the staircases even leads to a viewing gallery high on the very top of the castle walls. None of the towers have roofs. Inside the main castle building, there is scant evidence of where a handful of buildings once stood. The well, however, is still existent. Almost all of the outer curtain wall has disappeared, but the dry moat is in fairly good condition and can be accessed down one of the original stairways. At the bottom of this stairway, we can see a part of the original doorway where a heavy timber door would have once hung. Also, we can see recesses in the doorway where a heavy piece of timber would have served to keep the door firmly closed if the castle came under attack. At the moment, I'm working on a video where we explore the rest of the town of Rhuddlan. It includes the site of an earlier castle and some of the ancient historic buildings in Rhuddlan which still remain today. Once I've completed that video, there will be a link at the end of this video. Rhuddlan Castle is a short walk from the centre of Rhuddlan, which is well served by buses directly from places such as Prestatyn, Rhyl and Denbigh. The nearest railway stations are at Prestatyn and Rhyl. There is free car parking right beside the castle, but there is a small entrance fee to gain access to the castle grounds. Dogs on leads are welcome, but are not allowed up any of the staircases. There is a small visitor centre with a loo and small selection of gifts. Before visiting, I strongly recommend checking the up-to-date opening hour times, as the castle is usually closed from the end of October through to as late as April. The town of Rhuddlan itself has a comprehensive range of facilities, including pubs, sandwich shops, cafes and restaurants. Please remember to like, subscribe and perhaps even leave a comment. It's now time for me to say goodbye. Well, vour and have a grand tour!